Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jesse Morandi, and I'm the Vice President of the Walt Whitman Initiative, and I am proud to introduce the fifth installation from our robust American Love speaker series. We decided to offer this speaker series, note the word speaker, we're not doing a lecture, we are trying to do something timely, public-facing, and basically conversations on Whitman's life, work, and legacy. Excuse me. These are not designed to be academic talks, but free and open and informal discussions that we end by inviting your questions for Q&A with our speakers. So those watching on YouTube, please post your questions in the chat section so that we can have a dialogue at the end of this great conversation. And if you miss one of our events, you can always catch them on the Walt Whitman Initiative's YouTube channel. And if you would like to know more about what's coming up, please check out our website, waltwhitmaninitiative.org. Next week, we have the pleasure of being joined by Karen Carbiner, who will be having a conversation with Brian Selznick, the author and illustrator of many books, including The Invention of Hugo Cabret, the basis for the Oscar-winning movie Hugo, and also the amazing book Wonderstruck. They'll be discussing their recent book, Live Oak with Moss, Whitman's Secret Same-Sex Love Poems. That'll be on September 17th. Same time, we're always between 6 and 7. And then on September 24th, Matt Miller and Zach Turpin will discuss their new book, Every Hour, Every Atom, a collection of Walt Whitman's early notebooks and fragments. So that's what's coming up in September. This week, I am so happy to be joined by Dee Swee and Arif Ullah, who will be discussing Walt Whitman, Whitman's 2 cents on COVID-19 relief and recovery, a really timely conversation around Whitman as an inspiration during these very difficult and challenging times. So please, everybody, welcome Dee and Arif, and you guys take it away. We're so happy to have you.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you, Jesse. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. And I would like to have my partner, Arif, first introduce himself while I put up. Oh, let me first share my screen with the slides. One moment. Here we go.
Thank you, Dee. Thanks, Jesse. And like Jesse said, this is not going to be academic at all. We're really coming at this discussion with a different perspective. And Dee will outline that for you. My name again is Arif Ullah, and my background is as a community organizer. And I'm committed to various issues of racial and environmental and social justice. Most recently, I worked at an organization that supported community building efforts among grassroots community groups across the city in primarily low-income neighborhoods. And right now, in my volunteer capacity, I'm doing work around environmental justice and also at a community garden, growing food and keeping bees. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you, Arif. I'm really excited to be having this discussion with you tonight. So a bit about me, my name is Dee. I am a storyteller who uses writing, photography, and videography to tell stories about social justice. And I've been exploring topics of public history, historic preservation, arts and cultural organizing, gentrification, and building resilient communities. And here I want to make a plug for one of my recent documentaries, Son of Ourselves, Cultural Activism in Whitman's New York, which premiered last year at the Walt International Whitman Week. Through this film, I wanted to look at how and why Whitman was still relevant 200 years after his birthday. So I invited 3 Whitmaniacs, scholars and cultural activists to talk about their work, engaging the public and relating Whitman to the everyman of New York City. So today we're gonna actually take a very similar approach by looking at how the ideas that Whitman raised in his years can still be connected to what is already happening at the moment. Neither Arif nor I are Whitman experts. that is a disclaimer. So we really want to approach this topic through our community organizing lens and hope it will spark further conversations. So now I'll turn to Arif to discuss the concept of aftertimes.
Thanks, Dee. So I really like this idea and concept of aftertimes that Whitman spoke about, and that a professor whose quote I'll share in the next slide, but just pausing on this for a moment, I also wanted to just share. So Whitman, in this quote you see, brings up this concept of aftertimes. And it's a time of both crisis and opportunity. And as Professor Glaude, when talking about Baldwin, James Baldwin, the seminal American writer, writes here in this quote, and I actually want to read it because I think it's a powerful one. For Whitman, out of the ashes of the Civil War emerged a nation bustling with the energy of commerce, endowed with a vast and more appointed body, but with little or no soul. In this context, national rage and fury served as warning signals that were invaluable for aftertimes. The phrase refers at once to the disruption and the splintering of old ways of living and the making of a new community after the fall. The aftertimes characterize what was before and what is coming into view. And so I think Professor Glaude's statement sums up for me this idea at this particular moment with all that's happening. A white supremacist in the White House, an international pandemic with all its ripple effects, and a movement for racial justice. So we're in a moment of crisis, but that also means that we're in a moment of great opportunity and great possibility. And so with that, I will turn it, I think, back over to Dee.
Great, thank you, Arif. So with the lens of community organizing and the framing of after times that Arif just described, we're gonna start today's exploration through first with the theme culture. So for those of you who are familiar with Whitman, you probably know that Whitman's deeply immersed into different cultural activities. He was a frequent of Brooklyn art studios. He enjoyed oratory and going to the opera. He was really nourished by the vibrant cultural scene in New York City. And Whitman really championed the importance of culture as it is really crucial to forming a moral identity. It informs who we are, how and why we act in certain ways, and how to move forward. So he supported the freedom of individual expression, which is also key to building a robust cultural environment that is friendly to all.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about youth and in the context of COVID and how this pandemic is impacting them, specifically as related to the culture of learning and teaching in the COVID era. So as we consider culture in the COVID era, which I think we all know goes beyond the arts, it's imperative that we examine how the culture of teaching and learning has suddenly and dramatically shifted, especially for young people. Though the confines of classrooms and test-oriented lessons were never ideal, there were at least the elements of being in community as students, in each other's physical presence. That alone is important, just being in each other's presence. Whitman often spoke about the importance of spiritual and physical connectivity, which of course has been under threat for years now, most recently and most seriously with the advent of social media, at least as I see it. I know, lots of people sing the praises of social media, and of course there are some redeeming values of it, but as I see it, it also compromises to some extent the spiritual connectivity that Whitman spoke of. And COVID has just accelerated that physical isolation and disconnection. As classrooms have moved online and as learning has become remote, especially for children, this will have lasting impacts. And kids from low-income backgrounds are feeling this in an even deeper way because their access to extracurricular resources and activities are limited to begin with. And so with that, I'd like to go to the next slide and just read what the city's plan is for teaching young people, teaching kids in public schools. So the city's plan calls for a mix of in-person and remote learning, with students taking turns in classrooms when they return in the fall. But as you can see from this statement, more than a quarter of students have decided to go with the all remote option instead. And, you know, can't really blame them because people are scared. And the school, though they have a plan, you know, it just seems like a very sort of last minute type thing that they've pulled together. And so what that means is that there will still be a lot of students who are learning remotely, who are disconnected spiritually, physically from their classmates, who are robbed of a community experience with other students. And that, again, will really have some lasting impacts. So Dee, can you go on to the next slide? So social isolation, which I was just talking about in the context of classrooms, is present across society right now, more than ever before with COVID. And so for youth and adults alike, this pandemic is really taking a toll on mental health. And in this next slide, you'll see some of the stats collected by the Mental Health Fund, which illustrates the toll that COVID-19 is taking on mental health. You'll see these stats before COVID, and you'll see them now. And so just teasing out a couple of these, feeling isolated from others, I mean, that's a pretty dramatic increase, right? We had something like 25% before COVID, and now we're looking at, you know, 70+% possibly. Looking at feeling nervous or anxious, we were at under 20% before, and what we're looking at now is 90%. So those are some really stark, as well as, I think, worrying stats. And it's no surprise either. And that COVID has been associated with a host of mental health challenges really supports studies and research that have been done across the years on social isolation. Symptoms of anxiety and depressive disorder increased considerably in the US during April to June of 2020. And again, as you saw in the slide, that was very much a different scenario and situation in 2019, pre-COVID. So Dee, I'd like to ask you a question right now. We've looked at some of the challenges posed by COVID as related to the culture of teaching and learning and is connected to mental health. Focusing just on culture, if you would, what do you see as additional challenges?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Arif. That is a great one that I've been contemplating a lot. Mm-hmm. I think what I read from Whitman's poetry and how his work stand out was because he wants to appeal and speak to everyone, the general public, including the working class. And this is what we all strive for, which is accessibility of culture programming, the accessibility of culture. I'm grateful to see that a lot of large cultural institutions, including Broadway and the Met, are making their programs available online, free to the public. I just want to highlight that even though that removed the monetary bar to attend these performances, there's still the technological barrier. As Arif just mentioned, with remote learning, we'll see that there are a lot of people who don't have tablet or a laptop or a stable internet connection for them to be able to appreciate these masterpieces. And at the same time, it is also hard for people who are just running around every day, try to make ends meet and get their families together to find the time and leisure to appreciate these art. I guess one of the biggest barrier or challenges I've been working around these days is the psychological barrier, which is the sense of feeling out of place and feeling lack of knowledge. I've had a lot of experiences working with artists through museums and galleries and just culture programming in general. And I've talked to people who felt like that. I haven't taken any art history classes, so I don't know how to look at this painting. I don't think going to see a ballet or an opera is something for me. That is one of the most heartbreaking thing I've heard. kind of breaking that psychological barrier, this eliteness of culture, is a challenge I've been grappling with. I recall that recently I heard from a Black harpist, a female harpist, speaking about how a lot of young Black girls go to her and connect with her on Instagram, try to learn from her, get her advice on how to become a successful musician. She is really eager to help, but at the same time, she found it heartbreaking that when she tried to become a musician, there was no Black female harpist for her to look up to. So when we see a stage full of white performers or see a gallery of works all done by well-educated elite artists, it is really hard for the underprivileged people to find that sense of belonging, that sense of relateness. So I guess in general, I just want to meditate on this idea of accessibility and what it actually entails. It is really nuanced than just making it free for all. Hope that answers your question. And then we want to also leave you with a potential remedy, or I should say some ideas that we could inspire by Whitman, but also address some of the topics that we just mentioned. So some cultural programming that we could do. I brought up this example, Vanishing Leaves, which is actually produced by Jesse Morandi, who was the host who introduced us earlier from the Whitman Initiative. This is a location-based mobile app to explore Brooklyn Heights. Through this game, you'll be able to explore different parts of the neighborhood. You can stay outdoors and you do not have to go in large groups. So it's safe to play it now if you want to do it alone with a few close friends. And I also find that the increased number of neighborhood tours after the pandemic, because people are forced to stay within the country, within the state, or even just within their community. This is actually a great time for people to slow down and start to talk to their neighbors, get to know their community better. And that is actually what Whitman was doing during his time. He very much frequented a lot of places in New York City. He built over 30 homes in Brooklyn, and he's really a lifelong champion of New York City. So now with the pandemic and with these new technological equipment, we could also explore different ways that we connect with our neighborhood and bring these programs more available to everyone with the younger generation with remote learning. And I also want to just highlight that arts and culture in general, or cultural programming in general, that can also include programs that address mental health issues. For example, we've seen a lot of healing circles, checking in with neighbors, learning about stress management, using art therapy. Sometimes those kind of programs will require some kind of intimacy. You would want to share your grief, anxiety, and loss of loved ones with close groups, and that is also something on the rise. So now we're moving on to our next theme, which is environment. And then I would want to show a really short clip from my documentary, and I want you to hear from our beloved Greg Tripiano. So let me pull up the video.
Well, my name is Greg Tripiano. I'm the artistic director of the Walt Whitman Project. The Walt Whitman Project is a community-based arts organization. Our major function is to remind people that Walt Whitman spent a third of his 72 years in Brooklyn. Now, I chose this site, Fort Greene Park, as a setting today because the park exists in large part because Walt Whitman in 1846 and 1847, when he was the editor of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, said, Brooklyn needs a park. Brooklyn was a fast-growing city at that time, and there wasn't a place for recreation. And Whitman lobbied to get a place for the working population to come and to relax, to be in contact with nature.
So we'll pause here. So we just heard from Greg about Whitman's connection to Fort Greene Park, which is actually a park that I frequented when I lived in Brooklyn. I want to bring to your attention this quote written by Whitman when he was the editor at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. He was asking for a place for recreation, but as Greg mentioned, it was not only a green space for people. There were areas, open space that were accessible in the outskirts of city, but it was not accessible to everyone, especially for the working class. So Whitman was asking for open green space for everyone, and also for people to be able to actively use these spaces. I really want to draw to your attention these two keywords that he brought up: wholesome rest and fresh air. So looking at how COVID has impacted the environment, one of the major issue is health, and this includes both physical health and mental health. With the lockdown and stay-at-home orders, residents really need an open space to be able to be physically active, but also safely interact with others so they can maintain their social well-being. However, access to high-quality green space is not equally driven among the city, and this is also a concept that I want to introduce, which is green poverty, the inequitable distribution of quality green spaces. The next topic will be food security and healthy diet. We've probably all either seen in person or heard through news outlets about the long lines outside food banks and soup kitchens. Many food banks ran out of resources a few weeks after the lockdown, and we really need a non-polluted environment to grow edibles so that we can ensure a sustainable stream of fresh produce to all the communities, and so that they will be able to make healthy diet, which is really central to their living. So what I just discussed in terms of the access to green space, access to non-polluted environment, all ties up into this concept of environmental inequity. We all share this planet. However, a lot of the resources that many people take for granted is not accessible to everyone. Access to fresh water, access to greenery, access to non-polluted air. For example, just here locally in New York City, a lot of people really loved the grocery delivery services that we get during the pandemic. So you can get your grocery delivered to your doorstep without going out, which I also really love. But at the same time, we have to think about the consequences of having these services. There is the Fresh Direct site in South Bronx, which is with the daily loads of trucks and also industrial dumping, it is sharply increasing the rate of asthma for residents in the adjacent communities. It also has a wide area of health problems caused for these communities who usually have a weaker voice. Climate change is a big one. New York City is an island. A lot of times we don't really think about it, but for those waterfront communities, the rise of sea level and the coming of these hurricanes is really making them have to think how they're going to survive in the coming years. So now I just talked about all of these issues and topic and concepts, and I want to turn to Arif and see if you want to share your insight on how this COVID-19 has either exacerbated or influenced these problems, and how do you think that they're manifested at the moment?
Thank you, Dee. Thanks for taking us through all those very important issues. And I'm really glad you spoke about how environmental inequity isn't just in other countries. That picture is, could be from, like my part of the world, but these injustices, these inequities are right here in our own backyards. Like you said, the South Bronx. In fact, the South Bronx has the highest rate of asthma in the entire country. The reason for that is because of the environmental pollution that exists there, whether it's a waste transfer station located in some of these lower income neighborhoods, or as you mentioned, Fresh Direct warehouse, which is seeing hundreds and hundreds of trucks leaving and coming back daily. And so as we think about environmental inequity, environmental racism, as we think about COVID-19, and as you put it, COVID-19 being a respiratory disease, we really need to think about how lower income communities are being impacted by that, right? And so, just put simply, someone with a pre-existing respiratory health condition obviously is just more vulnerable to contracting COVID and also suffering more from COVID, getting sicker, and it might be more lethal for them. And so that's a manifestation and a result of how environmental inequity impacts certain communities. And like you said, lower income people and people of color are more likely to live in these areas with high rates of pollution. Of course, one of the first casualties of COVID was the shutting down of public green spaces, which we later learned didn't really have to happen because open green spaces and open spaces are actually good for us, right? So we now have, at least in my neighborhood and I think in other neighborhoods, I'm in Jackson Heights, we have an entire avenue stretching about 25 blocks that's been closed to traffic to give people more open space to walk in. And so closing down of public spaces, open green spaces, parks, even community gardens were instructed to stay closed. Later on, members of community gardens were given permission to use the community gardens, but not keep open hours for anyone in the public to come in. Now, again, those with means, can afford to leave the city for a weekend, go somewhere for that fresh air, for that open green space. But there are a lot of people who simply don't have that luxury, who don't have that privilege. And that gets back to environmental inequity, right? Like how our access to certain privileges mean everything, make all the difference. In terms of organizing, there's been a lot of environmental justice organizing happening for years now. And I think New York comes a little late to the table as compared to, for example, California. But that's true for a lot of issues. California just, is ahead of the curve. But New York State last year adopted the strongest piece of climate legislation in the country, the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act. And many of us this year were looking at pushing that even further and also really giving that teeth through funding for that law. But with the COVID crisis happening as the budget decisions were being made on the state level, like that came to a halt. And that really set back a lot of efforts. And so there was a brief pause and setback when COVID hit, and groups dealt with the immediate threat and impact of the pandemic. And like I said, there were setbacks for legislation as well. But in recent months, environmental justice organizations have been becoming more creative in terms of building solidarity with other movements, most specifically the racial justice movement. There has always been a connection between racial justice and environmental justice. We just spoke about that, Dee, right? Like with these factories, warehouses being, waste transfer stations being placed in low-income neighborhoods. Those connections were always there, right? If you look at parts of the world that experience the greatest impact on the environment, these are parts of the world that aren't the wealthiest parts of the world, right? And so this connection that the environmental justice movement is making is long overdue, but I'm glad that that's happening. And actually on September 20th, there's a citywide racial and climate justice march starting at Columbus Circle. So Jesse, I think you're not too far from there. So I want to see you at that march. But of course, if you can't make it, I understand, because there is still some trepidation, some hesitation about being out in crowded spaces, right? And that's real. And not everyone will be able to do that. So there's that going on. There's a petition going around and pressure being put on the city to bring back the city's compost program, which was canceled with the advent of COVID. And so, these are just some things that are happening. There, in my neck of the woods in Jackson Heights in Northwest Queens, some of us are organizing around stopping a local power plant from adopting new fossil fuel technology. So we've got this law in place now, for clean energy, and instead of really staying honest, staying true to clean energy, committed to clean energy, this energy company, NRG, what they're hoping to do is adopt energy harvested from fractured gas, hydrofractured gas, that's not going to solve the climate crisis. And so some of us are organizing around that. So those are some examples of how environmental justice organizing is happening, and also how those things are related to environmental equity and racial justice. So thanks, Dee.
Those were really amazing examples.
Thank you.
Do you want to talk about how some kind of solutions for additional efforts?
Yeah, I really think that those, solutions really, kind of like are exemplified in these movements that I just described, and I'm sorry I didn't sort of couch it in that, remedy title, but, these are really the remedies, people coming together despite these immense challenges and continuing to organize, being resilient, right? And so, yes, we're in the midst of a pandemic. Yes, we are looking at, a minimum of 6 months before a vaccine, may become available. But at the same time, people are organizing. People are organizing around, climate justice. People are organizing around, stopping a local plant from, adopting new fossil fuel technology. And so I think that, the remedy in this case, as I think is the thread across everything that we're really discussing here today, is just, people being resilient, people at the most grassroots level being resilient, right? Coming together and not being intimidated by, this really historic time that we find ourselves in. Being careful, yes, but not letting that stop our work. And, one of the things that Whitman often spoke about is, this idea of individualism, which, in itself, I find, sort of raw individualism troubling. But Whitman followed that up with community, right? He wasn't talking about a capitalist, sort of individualist, raw individualism where everyone, every man for himself, every person for themselves, right? But really individualism in terms of pursuit of liberty, but pursuit of liberty in a way that really upholds equality for everyone, right? And we're going to get into that in a little bit. So I would say that in terms of remedy, Dee.
Yeah, thank you, Arif. And I really take away from what you said as the resiliency, but also the strength in coming together, the coalitions. You were mentioning the intersection of racial justice and environmental justice, and how groups, different campaigns can come together at one point. So I think that's one of the takeaways from me, seeing community groups working towards goals. Sometimes people might not have the same goal, but ultimately we're all trying to fight over this systemic inequality, the structural violence that we all face. So it is sometimes good to find your partner and form this coalition, which is amazing. And then I just want to point out as an example what Arif just mentioned, all of those movements, demonstrations are amazing. There are a lot of efforts around. If you're interested in learning more how you can get involved, Arif is definitely the person to get in touch to. As an example, I want to mention the benefit of having community gardens, especially during the pandemic. As you can see in this picture, this is a dense residential area, but having this green space, this little, almost like an oasis in this urban complex is really important. Gardeners will be able to, first, they have this space to breathe and interact with each other safely with social distancing during this time. They are also able to grow their own produce. We've also seen a lot of experienced gardeners teaching other people how to grow food. The moment they teach a kid about how to grow a tomato, they're gonna start to get a little closer to it. And step by step, they're gonna know it's not just a ketchup you find in McDonald's, but it's actually a tomato grown from the soil. So that way, a lot of these community garden groups also use this space to teach youth, engage others in healthy diet. There are also a lot of cultural events that can happen in these gardens. So community gardens are not just an environmental tool. It is really a place, a locus for a lot of cultural, environmental organizing that can happen in the city. So Arif alluded to this topic a little before, and we really think it's important to talk about democracy and equity during this moment, but also related to Whitman's idea. So now I'm going to show another clip from my documentary film. Let me pull up the video. And we will be hearing from Karen Carpenter, who will be speaking next week. This is another plug. Great.
On him. Whitman is very much a voice of the people, and I feel like he speaks directly to the people of New York, and that's always been a mission of mine in my work, to emphasize that. His words appear a lot in New York. Right now they wind around the AIDS memorial. That is a sculpture of Song of Myself. You can also find him in Brooklyn along the ferry landing, where he used to take the Fulton Ferry across. There's words from crossing Brooklyn Ferry there. You've got to visit Ample Hills Creamery when you're in Brooklyn, because that's also named after a line from crossing Brooklyn Ferry. We've got Whitman's restaurant now in 2 locations. So Whitman is very much present, but I think also the spirit of his work, the democratic message, the egalitarian pose that he takes is a really important message for us politically today. In fact, here we're sitting in Hungarian pastry shop, and right outside the window, there's a sign, "All are welcome here." And I think Whitman would have written that, when he was alive here in the city. And that's very much part of our work at the Whitman Initiative, to put poetry on the streets of New York, but also the democratic message of Whitman, and to enable people who might not have access to poetry to have it.
So we're gonna pause here. If you're interested in seeing my full film, is available on my website. So check it out if you're interested in learning more. So Karen just introduced Whitman's idea of equality, democracy. Our welcome is a great manifestation of his idea, but I also want to mention that this or welcome is in an kind of idealized environment and idealized world. Sometimes we need to re-examine and reflect on the system that we are living in, even though we are supposedly living in a democratic system. But a lot of the problems we just mentioned was the environmental justice, environmental inequity, with the cultural inaccessibility to the underprivileged communities. We can see that systemic inequity has only got exacerbated or more manifested by this COVID-19, and is shown in many aspects, including access to healthcare, access to fresh produce. The ability to work remotely is a privilege. The ability to obtain education remotely is a privilege. Also, the ability to take a private ride instead of riding the MTA every day to work or running errands is also a privilege. There are a lot of these smaller bits and pieces that we sometimes just ignore in the daily life, but those are actually moments that we should stop and reflect on all of these structural problems that we experience.
All right, so Dee, if I can ask you a question, thanks for taking us through that. Thanks for your video piece. I'm looking forward to seeing all of it finally. I agree with everything you just said. I also am curious about, you are an immigrant to this country, and as an immigrant, and so am I, I should say, so am I. As an immigrant and as someone who supports community building work at the most grassroots level, can you share your definition of democracy and equity?
Yes, I think they should be really nuanced concepts. And what I really take away from these ideas are the capacity, being able to claim who you are, where you're from, being able to claim your own narrative, craft it in the way that you believe in, and have other people heard it, is what to me is rooted in is at core of democracy. It also means being able to claim your right and get your seat at a table. That also means the right to say no. And also the ability to make your own judgment, to have your own thinking and have it get heard. At the same time, it's really important to learn to acknowledge and respect differences. There might be differences that we can never resolve. We will just stay in that way, but at least there should be the hearing, the understanding process before it. And sometimes I guess can get a little brushed off is that we need giving some extra support to the disadvantaged communities to bring everyone at a table. Equity doesn't mean that we give everyone the same percentage of volume, but we sometimes have to bring up the volume for certain people to have them get heard. And I really want to say that certainly we cannot talk about democracy and equity in the United States now without naming racism, which is very much alive and well present in today in this country. With the advent of COVID-19, we've seen a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. The narrative of these Asian communities are taken away. There is just this dominant voice making a statement with non-vetted sources. And there are a lot of people who just follow this narrative without making their own rational thinking and judgment. So I think this is a counterexample of democracy and taking away someone's narrative, not being able to claim who you are. And of course, racism isn't perpetrated by just ignorant vigilantes, as we're seeing with the anti-Asian violence. Sadly, it really exists within our institutions, the very institutions that are meant to uphold fairness and equality, all of these amazing qualities we're discussing today. So Arif, can you talk about more about this in relation to the current Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dee, for sharing your personal experience there. It's a powerful one, and it is very sad, all of the stories that we have been hearing the last several months about the anti-Asian hate crimes. And I'm glad that you're staying safe. Yeah, I can talk a bit about the Black Lives Matter movement. I will also just preface it with the fact that I think that, it would be remiss if we didn't say that, the jury is still out on Whitman's own complicated relationship with race. And I think more research needs to be done about his thoughts on slavery, etc. I'm not a Whitman scholar, of course, but, certainly I have listened to some news programs and read some articles about this. So, I feel like that should be mentioned, particularly in a group that is focused on Whitman and generally celebrates with Whitman. I would like to ask, yes, thank you for bringing up this quote, which I think is a powerful one and really resonates with me. Re-examine all you have been told in school or church or in any book. Basically just re-examine all you have been told and dismiss whatever insults your own soul. I think this quote does a good job framing the Black Lives Matter discussion for most Americans, and here I'll say specifically for most white Americans. They've believed in the country's Pledge of Allegiance and its commitment to liberty and justice for all. They believed that our system of justice is fair, from the creation of laws by legislators to the enforcement of laws by police forces to the implementation of law by its courts. Now, they believe this because, put simply, that's been their experience. The system has worked for them, likely because it was made by and for them, as simple as that. And for the most part, white Americans have remained ignorant and sometimes willfully to the realities of non-white Americans, especially Black folks. But we're at a moment in history that compels them to reckon with the persistent and egregious violence of racism because there's simply too much irrefutable evidence for them to turn a blind eye. At least the ones who aren't white supremacists, like the one in the White House. The widespread use of smartphones equipped with cameras has made everyone into a potential human rights documentarian. And so there is a democratization effect that's happening with those smartphones. Whereas that was the privilege of just a few people who were able to document, were the ones who were able to frame the news. Now you've got everyday people who are able to document and share it widely. So as much as social media, I expressed my reservations about social media has also served as a powerful tool to get this information out, whereas before that wouldn't have been possible. But getting back to the widespread use of phones and it being irrefutable, the violence largely at the hands of an institution charged with protecting us, namely police departments, this violence is now on camera. It's on camera, and these incidents that are happening just can't be denied anymore. So looking away would make us complicit. Right? And so I bring back the part of Whitman's quote where he asks us, re-examine all you have been told. And he says, all you have been told in school, but in church, and I would say all you have been told in the media, all you have been told by, your elected representatives. Just re-examine all you have been told. And I think that that's something that we all really need to do. And with this evidence that all of us are now seeing, with our own eyes, there's simply no way we can turn away. Again, turning away would make us complicit. Now that part of the quote also reminds me of a sentence from Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. And I love Toni Morrison. I mean, on the topic of writers, I think she's a sorceress. I mean, I think her writing is incredible. I would like to get involved in a Toni Morrison group at some point, right? But in Beloved, she writes, definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. And I think that connects well with Whitman's, the first part of Whitman's quote, re-examine all you have been told. Now, the second part of Whitman's quote, dismiss what insults your soul, really powerful. And, obviously it's a blatant call to action. He's asking us, inviting us, right? Look, do not stand for injustices, right? Dismiss it. And dismissing, I think, necessitates action, right? So it's not just like, I'm going to ignore it. That's not what he's saying. I take it as a call to action for everyone. And in my mind, as much as Black Lives Matter isn't a response to Whitman's invitation, right, to take action, it is sort of upholding that, in its own way, right? It's answering that call, and as I see it, racism is an insult to the soul. So dismiss what insults your soul. Racism insults our soul, right? As a country, it insults our soul. So beyond protests, beyond marches, beyond demonstrations, people have also been taking into their own hands the care and stewardship of their own community. So sort of connecting the marches and the Black Lives Matter movement, I want to also say that there are other ways that people have been sort of taking this call on. And one of the most powerful ways that that's happening is through these mutual aid networks, right? And so Dee, I'll ask you to speak about that now.
Yeah, thank you, Arif. So I think this is a perfect example of what we just discussed, but also going back to the very concept of democracy and equity, which is claiming your right, but also fulfilling your civic responsibility. It is not only taking, but also giving. So these mutual aid networks are really giving people the right and the tool to support their own communities, and they're really hyper-local groups that see the needs in their network and just give out a hands to give them a help. So I really think that this is the very first step. So as I mentioned earlier, acknowledging and appreciating differences is key to democracy and equity. And I think the very first step to that is listening to each other. As I mentioned earlier, getting people heard. So it is never the same that you learn about a homebound senior story from the news and how difficult that is than actually talking to one in person. Even though you might not be able to see each other's face or hug each other, this is really genuine connection and communication. This is precious and effective connection building. It is more than just like liking an image on Facebook. So I really see the value of these amazing mutual aid networks, but more importantly for these connections that would have not been made in the normal world. So these mutual aid networks have been really effective during this pandemic. And I'm also really curious to see how they will be sustained or not sustained, or how they will be evolved after the pandemic. So that's also a question for me as coming from this community organizing lens, and how we can make use of it. So we want to leave you with an action item for the end of the day. How many have completed the census? I cannot see your hands up, or yes, oh, Reef, great. Hopefully you filled it out. For those of you who are amazing, Jesse, me too. For those of you who are comfortable with completing the census, but have not done so, please do so as soon as possible, because the deadline is coming up, is by the end of this month, September 30th. You can do it online, on the phone, either get the mailed census form or get a census taker to get it in person. There are numerous organizations out there that are helping people to fill out a census. You can also reach out to NYC Census or the Census Bureau for any assistance. It's also available in different languages, so I would encourage you to take it. And the census will determine the representation in the House, determines funding, allocation, and distribution. And more importantly, it really supports our frontline workers that have been fighting furiously during the pandemic for all of us. It will really help to improve your local healthcare system, get the mental health support to those who need. It will help with your youth program and education. A lot of schools are needing funding for the remote learning devices, getting outdoor learning experiences, getting parks renovated and open to people, employment assistance, cultural programs. All of the issues that we talked about today and those that we didn't get to name today can potentially be impacted by you completing the census. So this is actually a chance for you to claim your right and get your voice heard. So we want to end today's presentation with this quote from the beginning of Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Arif. So I will now turn to Jesse for questions, further discussions.
Thanks so much for that. I must say, a bit overwhelmed, because it brings back so much of the moment and the potency of so many of these different facets of what we've been experiencing right now. I think, there'll be many books and many stories told from this time because of that complexity. I mean, just you've laid it out so well. Within this pandemic crisis is this moment of racial justice, cries for representation, for acknowledgement, for so much that is going on. And, it's difficult to pull them apart. They are very separate, yet at this moment, they're so interconnected, all these different forces happening at once. And one, racial justice has such a long history, and the other one has arrived and suddenly shifted us in these new ways that are startling and have upset the social structure in a very short amount of time. Yet one, the COVID crisis is actually, I feel like, bringing attention to and making this a perfect moment to acknowledge and face this other one. It's such an interesting confluence of elements all at once. So I think you did a great job of showing how the ecological injustice is also connected to so many social issues. And so once you start getting to that web of different elements in society that have created this really unique moment, I think it can be shocking for people, because we're in one respect dealing with the day-to-day of just surviving, right? And then the other side, there's this important moment of self-reflection that's happening when we are forced to be alone. So I thank you for putting together such a cohesive yet expansive view of this moment. So I guess I want to bring it back to Whitman for just a second. And you know, in Song of the Open Road, he says, "Here's the test of wisdom," and bear with me so I can read this quote and then have you respond. "Here's the test of wisdom. Wisdom is not finally tested in schools. Wisdom cannot be passed from one having it to another not having it. Wisdom is of the soul. It is not susceptible of proof. It is its own proof." And he goes on to say, "Now I re-examine philosophies and religions. They may prove well in lecture rooms, yet not prove at all under the spacious clouds and along the landscape and the flowing currents." And what I think he's saying here is that we are required to go out into the world and to experience and to come to our own revelations, to our own understanding of the world around us. So tell me a little bit about what you guys have both learned during this past half year that you can share with us. And maybe, you know, there's a lot of issues at the moment, but also maybe give us something that you found that gives you hope about this moment, because it is such a moment of change and opportunity. So I'm going to throw it back to you, and please respond to that in any way that you feel.
Go ahead, Dee.
I was waiting for you so I could get more time to think about it. Yeah. I actually was doing some reflection lately, and if I were to pick a keyword for this year, I would say is adaptation, or just change. I recently talked to someone about how to reflect and how to kind of deal with a lot of the uncertainties that we've been all going through. Is uncertainty from the pandemic, uncertainties from the life of our families and loved ones, uncertainty from work, uncertainty from just everything almost. However, if you flip the coin, you'll see that this is also, as we talked about earlier through the after times, is a moment for change and for adaptation. If we take it a little too more pragmatically, it means that if you kind of change your mindset, this will be the opportunity for you to examine yourself and examine the world to see what you truly want and what you can truly contribute. So for me, it really made me more at ease when I started to think about what I care about and how I can adapt to the world. But at the same time, we shouldn't always be catching up with the world, because the world is always changing. But what is really important is that you realize what is essential for you, and you try to keep that up with the world and try to find that connection. It is a lesson learned for me. Hopefully that was clear.
Yeah,
Thanks, Dee.
That makes me think of a Black woman science fiction writer who I really like, Octavia Butler. At the beginning of her book, Parable of the Sower, she writes, all that we touch, we change. All that we change changes us. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And I think that's true. I mean, I think that, that's something we simply can't do anything against. Change is going to happen. And so it's up to us to determine how we adapt to change, how we interact with change, how we move with change. I mean, for me, I think it's a combination of both. Like, there are things that I'm hopeful for Jesse, as well as things that kind of trouble me as well. I'll focus on the hopeful part. And that is our resilience. I mean, we talked about resilience earlier, and even in this moment of crisis, neighbors were coming together, to help elders in their buildings, right? We had a system going on in my building, right, to do their groceries. People were just being resourceful, figuring out ways to really support each other. And in some cases, in spite of the government, right? Not with the support of government. And you know, that really gives me hope that we will be able to get beyond this and other challenging situations. And we have been able to get beyond other challenging situations. It's a very unique one for us. At least we haven't had one like this in a very long time, but just community, you know, community coming together, people relying on each other. Dee talked about the mutual aid networks. Um, Dee talked about the mutual aid networks. I mean, I take hope in that, you know. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, I think I think that idea of like being aware of change when it is in front of us and being, you know, being able to, well, you know, we have our challenges on the day to day and then in the long term. And I think every day is that kind of like facing that change. And I think there's this danger that we get accustomed to this anxiety, right? That we normalize these social changes in a way that, you know, it becomes transparent again as we just start to deal with, like, we all wear a mask all the time. You know, that we hear certain things and we just internalize them and turn away from them. And what I really found so powerful about the Black Lives Matter movement was that we were forced to look at that change in the face and also look at how we could change within, because we're not some static concrete entity, right? We have the capacity to change. And I really like that you brought up the challenges with Whitman, because, you know, Whitman isn't here anymore and we are only responsible for how we deal with this moment. Whitman is a great vehicle to actually look at the problems of, you know, perspective on race, because we can imagine him in his time in the Civil War, what he thought, but we can't really be in his shoes. We can only be here in this moment where we are seeing around us this great sea change. So thank you once again, you guys, for bringing that to the fore here. And I think, you know, we have to keep re-examining. We can't feel like we've reached a plateau and we're like, okay, we've done enough. You know, we have Flint, Michigan, we have police brutality, we have an election coming up, and there's so much to deal with, but we keep focused on, you know, our response to these things. Really the core, I think Whitman's passage about finding out for yourself and finding that truth, that's powerful to me, because I find those words resonate in this moment, particularly when I am only in charge of my response to this and what I can do as a reaction. What do you guys suggest, as just to wrap this up? You mentioned a lot of different things. Are there groups to support? Are there public arts for underrepresented groups that we can check out, that you know are doing cool things, but maybe not getting a lot of publicity as far as arts and public activism? Let's leave on some. I love that you ended on the census and vote. Holy cow! Please vote. Get your mail-in ballots if you can't go to the polling places. If you're in New York, at least.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jesse. I think, you know, aside from supporting good organizations and getting involved in like neighborhood level issues, which I think is really important, as well as, you know, supporting good legislation, right? I think it's really important for us to engage our families and our friends, right? Like particularly around some of these real, which could be sensitive issues, right? Oftentimes we organize with people who aren't so close to us. It's easier actually to do that, right? And so I think that it's really important for us to bring up some of these really difficult issues with our own families, with our own communities. And I think that, you know, it's in fact our responsibility to do that. So I would end with that for me. Dee?
I think that wrapped this up really beautifully. I guess I would just add on to it that what Arif mentioned, sometimes it can be easier to work with people who you are not so close with, but at the same time, there are a lot of amazing organizations that you could support a lot of neighborhood level issues, but at the same time, we should approach them with empathy and with care. Try to understand each other. Even that can also be taken when you talk to close friends or families who have different political agenda. And then, I guess, as I iterated in the presentation, the very first step is to stop and listen, so that we can both have effective communication. And then, hired as we go to an environmental justice demonstration or support outdoor learning for public schools, that's all the topics that we can work around. But the very first step is pause and listen.
Yeah.
Wow, thanks, Dee. That is a perfect way to end it, because really it all starts with that internal introspective reflection to make the change out in the world. So thank you so much for those great words to end this on. Thank you, Dee and Arif, for your time tonight and for sharing your thoughts and just a great kind of overview of so many things going on. And I really appreciate it. It's really, I hope this proves helpful to others, and we can continue this conversation. So maybe I'll see you at Columbus Circle.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse.
If we can run into each other.